welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to complete the sunflower stitch. This stitch I designed for my Autumn Rhapsody blanket that you can also find as a free pattern. That will be released beginning on September 9th in crochet along format, so it's going to be released over several parts. But this is the sunflower stitch that is part of part one of the blanket. So if you're interested in that blanket and you want to learn more details about that crochet along as well as the free pattern, go ahead and check out the link below in the description, and that will take you to the details about that crochet along. And as I am releasing parts of that pattern, I will add the links to the bottom description of this video as well. So about this stitch, this is a really fun and beautiful stitch. I love sunflowers, and if you love sunflowers, you're in the right place, especially if you don't like to sew, because that is the intent behind this sunflower stitch. The sunflower center is actually crocheted into the blanket as part of the pattern, and then the petals of the sunflower are then added after we have made that center. So they're added directly on. So no sewing is necessary for this stitch, which makes this a lot of fun. So to get started on this stitch, I have three colors here. I'm using up some scraps that I have left over from my Autumn Rhapsody blanket, and they are the same colors that I used for that first section of sunflowers in the blanket. So my color A here is going to be my pistachio green. Then I'm going to be using the coffee bean color for the sunflower centers, and then mustard yellow for the petals. These are Paint Box Cotton Aran yarn. I really enjoyed working with this. If you have never worked with this yarn, you should check it out because it is a lot of fun to use. This could certainly be made with any kind of yarn that you would like. I will mention that this stitch does benefit from a blocking. With the cotton yarn, I did a wet blocking in order to keep the petals open and not curled up, but they do have a tendency of curling up a bit. So with an acrylic yarn, you could sure try a wet blocking on that as well and see how that works for you. Even a light steam blocking may work as well with the acrylic yarn. Just be careful not to kill your acrylic when you're steaming it by overheating it. So, and we'll talk about that a bit more as I finish the video here. But we're going to go ahead and get started, and I am using a Clover crochet hook size H 5.0 millimeter crochet hook, which is the sunflower stitch is worked in multiples of 12, and then you're going to add 13. And then you're going to add 2 for your foundation chain. So for this video, I'm going to go ahead and chain a beginning foundation of 51. That's going to be multiples of 12, so 3 multiples of 12 equaling 36, adding in 13 for a total of 49, and then 2 for my foundation chain, 51. So let's get started. So to begin chaining that 51, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 49, 50, and 51. So with 51 chains on my hook, I'm going to double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook. So I'm going to skip the first 3 chains and work a double crochet in that 4th chain. Those skipped chains from the beginning are going to count as my first stitch. Now I'm simply going to work a double crochet in every chain to the end of this row. And what I'm doing is I'm simply building a base for those sunflowers. You're going to want a large enough base behind those sunflowers so the petals will cover that base basically, because those petals are pretty long. I'm basically just building a base here for those stitches. So really, you can build any base that you want with this stitch. If you wanted all of it to be single crochet, half double crochet, whatever stitch you wanted as your base would be perfectly fine. You're just going to want to make more rows of single crochet than you would for the double crochet. So I'm working 3 rows of double crochet. So I've worked a double crochet in every chain for row 1. I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to chain 3 for row 2. And that chain 3 is going to count as my first stitch. And then I'm just going to go ahead and work a double crochet in the remaining stitches through the end of the row. And then I'm going to work a 3rd row of double crochets, repeating row 2. So I will have 3 complete rows of double crochet before I start a row of single crochet for my beginning of the sunflower center. So I've worked 3 rows of double crochet. I'm going to go ahead and change colors now. And for my 4th row, I'm going to be working a row of single crochet with the color that I'm going to be using for the sunflower center. So I'm going to bring in my color B, and I'm going to turn, chain 1, single crochet at the base of that chain 1 in the same stitch, and I'm just simply doing 1 row of single crochets. And the reason I'm doing this, that I wanted to do 1 row of single crochet with the center color, is that when I'm working the sunflower centers in the next row, I'm going to be working them in both loops of 1 stitch. And what ends up happening, because I'm working several stitches into that 1 stitch in the loops separately, it creates a gap in there, like a hole in the center of that sunflower. And if I were to just start working that sunflower center after doing my last row of double crochets in the green, you would see that green show through in the center of that flower, and it's not very attractive. So you really want to have a base of single crochet all the way down before you start your sunflower center to give it a more professional and clean appearance, and that color, the green, doesn't show through the center of your sunflower. So go ahead and continue on finishing out this row in single crochets, and then we will begin our sunflower center. All right, so I've worked 1 row of single crochets. Now I'm ready for row 5. So I'm going to turn my work, and this is going to work my sunflower center. So to start out with, I'm going to chain 1, and I'm going to single crochet in that same stitch at the base of that chain 1, and then I'm going to single crochet in the next 5 stitches. So I'll have a total of 6 single crochets before I begin that first sunflower center. So to begin working that first sunflower center, we're going to be working in each of the loops of the next stitch individually. So I'm going to begin by working in the back loop of that stitch first, and I'm going to work 4 single crochets into that back loop. I'm going to place a stitch marker into that first stitch so I know where I started, and go ahead and place 4 single crochets into that back loop. So there's 2, 3, and 4. Now what I want to do is I want to work in that unused front loop, and I'm going to turn my work just slightly to make it easier to work in that front loop. So really I'm just kind of shifting my work to where I can get my hook into that unused front loop here. So now I'm going to place 4 single crochets into that front loop. So there's 2, 3, and 4. Now I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch into that first stitch that I made. So essentially what I did is I just made a circle, and you can see what I was talking about earlier. By working in both of those loops individually and placing 4 stitches in each loop, I created this little hole in the center, and that green yarn would have been visible through that hole if I wouldn't have done this 1 row of brown before I started my centers. So my first round of the sunflower center is completed. We're ready to move on to round 2. I'm going to start round 2 by chaining 1, and I'm going to place 2 single crochets in every stitch around. So I have a total of 8. Remember, I worked 4 in the back, 4 in the front. So I'm going to work 2 single crochets in every stitch, and that's going to give me a stitch count of 16 at the end. So you're going to want to work at the base of that chain 1 in that same stitch 2 single crochets, and I'm going to move my stitch marker up to that first stitch so I don't lose track of where I began this round. So that was 1. I'm going to work a second one in that same stitch, and now I'm going to work 2 single crochets in the remaining stitches. All the way around. And you're just going to keep rotating your work around, working that circle, placing 2 stitches in every stitch from that previous round. And when you've worked 2 stitches in each, we end up with 16. So let's verify our stitch count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So I have 16 total stitches, so that round is correct. And now I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch again to that first stitch. Now I don't want to make any more rounds, any more height to my stitch, but I want to work around this portion of the circle to get me back to my row. I don't want to fasten off and then attach my yarn back in, giving me more ends to weave in. I just want to get myself back to the place I need to be over here to begin working back into my row. So I'm going to slip stitch in each of the next 7 stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So you can see here that working the slip stitch into those first 8 stitches gets me back to where I am even with that row that I'm working. So now I want to find my next stitch. So I'm going to pull back the circle and look at my row here, and you can see I've worked this sunflower center in this stitch here. So my next stitch is this one here, and I'm going to go ahead and place a single crochet in each of the next 11 stitches. So working a single crochet in the next 11. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So that is how many stitches I'm going to be working in between my sunflower centers. And you come back here and you can see this circle. I worked those slip stitches around this top, came back to my row, worked my 11 single crochets back in that row. And that did two things actually. So not only did those slip stitches allow me to get back to my row so I didn't have to fasten off and refasten back on and tuck in ends, it also attached and kind of fastened down this circle a little bit better. It won't flop around quite as much as it would have if I would have fastened off and then come back down here and started single crocheting down here on my row. This would have allowed that circle to kind of curl up, and it wouldn't have fastened it down the way that this is doing. But by making those amount of stitches, it also doesn't bunch up my circle or create any issues with how that circle looks nice and flat. So now that we've worked those 11, I'm ready to work another sunflower center in that next stitch by doing exactly those same steps. And that's going to be working in the back loops only. So we're just picking up that back loop and I'm working 4 single crochets into that back loop. I'm placing my stitch marker into that first stitch so I don't lose track of my first stitch of this round, and I'm working 4 total single crochets into that back loop. So I have 4 single crochets. I'm rotating my work slightly to work in that unused front loop, placing 4 single crochets into it as well. So there's 3 and then 4. Rotating my work again, I'm going to slip stitch to that first stitch, make my second round for that center by chaining 1 and placing 2 single crochets in every stitch around, moving up my stitch marker to that first stitch. So continue working 2 stitches in every stitch all the way around that circle. Once we get back to the beginning, we're going to slip stitch into that first stitch. And then slip stitch into the next 7 stitches. Once I've worked those slip stitches, I'm going to come back down to my row and pull back that circle so I can easily see where my next stitch is and I don't skip one. And I'm going to work a single crochet in that next stitch back on my row, and it's going to be a total of 11 single crochets. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I'm ready to work my next sunflower, so I'm just going to repeat those same steps. I'm going to repeat that down to the end of the row until I have 6 stitches remaining unworked. So go ahead and work your sunflower center in the next stitch 11 single crochet stitches back on the row once you've completed that sunflower center. One more sunflower center after that, and you should have 6 stitches left at the end of the row. So I finished that last sunflower center. I'm at the end of my row with 6 stitches left. I'm just going to work a single crochet in each of those stitches to the end of my row. So I have finished the sunflower centers here, and they're going to lay better once I've put that next row of double crochets behind it. It's going to help keep these where I want them. But I did complete that whole section of sunflower centers, and you can see here I have 6 stitches here at the beginning before I start my first sunflower center, and I have 11 stitches in between each of these sunflower centers until I get to the end of my row, and I have 6 stitches left to work in here. We're ready to move on to the petals at this point, and we're going to work on row 5A, which is the petals. So I'm bringing in my color C, which is this mustard yellow here, and I'm going to work on the right side of these centers. So to work the petals of these sunflowers, I'm going to attach my color C to any stitch here of the center with a slip stitch. And I'm going to be working what I'm calling a sunflower picot. And a sunflower picot is going to be a slip stitch into the stitch that you're working, a chain 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to work a slip stitch into the second chain from the hook, making a picot, chaining 3, 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to come back down here and slip stitch to the same stitch that I started. I'm going to work a sunflower picot basically all the way around the outside edge of the center. So I'm going to, in the next stitch, slip stitch, chain 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4, slip stitch into that second chain, chain 3, and slip stitch to the same stitch as my beginning. Slip stitch into the next stitch, chain 4, slip stitch into the second chain, chain 3, slip stitch into that beginning stitch, slip stitch into the next. And it might be a little more difficult to slip stitch into the stitches that we had placed a slip stitch into, working around that last round. But just push it in there. You can work it into the top of the single crochet if that's a little bit easier. Work it into where the slip stitch is. Any place that works for you is fine, but it might be a little tight just because you did work the slip stitches into that stitch. So then chain 4, slip stitch into that second chain, chain 3, slip stitch back into the first stitch, slip stitch into the next stitch. And we're just repeating that all the way around in every stitch from that last round of the center. 1, 2, 3, and 4, slip stitch into the second chain, chaining 3, slip stitch back into the first stitch here. So I'm just going to continue on working that sunflower picot into each stitch around here. So I will have a total of 16 petals when I'm finished. So look how bright and cheerful those little petals are. So continue working in each stitch around a sunflower picot for a total of 16 of these petals. So when you finish that last petal, you have 16 petals on your sunflower center, you're going to just slip stitch to the first, into that first space of your first petal there. And then fasten off. And I have my first sunflower completed. I have 16 petals. And now I'm going to repeat those same steps for every one of my sunflower centers until those are all complete. Now I'm going to move on to row 6, and as you can see, I have not completed the petals for my sunflower centers, but I'm going to go ahead and work that next row of double crochet and show you how to do that so that you can see how to do that row even though you don't have the petals made. So I'm going to switch back to color A here, my green, and I'm going to just chain 3. Work a double crochet in each stitch of this row until I get to the sunflower center. So I'm going to work in each of these stitches. So I've worked those first 6 double crochets and I'm to that sunflower center. And to maintain my stitch count, remember that sunflower center is worked into a stitch. So I need to take into account that stitch if I want to keep my stitch count correct for this row. So what I'm going to need to do is pick up a stitch somewhere because I used both of those loops, and I also don't want the green showing through that hole from the sunflower center. So I want to work my green kind of around that. So I either, what I've done with mine is I pick up a stitch back behind that sunflower center, and it's from that single crochet from not the row previously, but from 2 rows back. So I'm working in that bar. There's a back bar there that I'm just going to work that stitch into, and that gives me that stitch that I should have worked into the stitch that the sunflower center is worked into to maintain my stitch count. You could also work 2 double crochets into this next stitch because you're going to skip over this whole section and your next stitch is clear over on the other side of your sunflower center. You could go ahead and just put 2 double crochets in this stitch because it will be kind of hidden by that sunflower center. So I could put 2 there instead, but I'm working that one stitch in that little bar down here from that previous row. And then I'm just going to work a double crochet in the next 11. So essentially I'm just working a double crochet in every stitch. And in order to maintain and get back to my stitch count where I need to be, I'm picking up a stitch back behind each of those sunflower centers. And then at the end, I'm verifying that I've gotten back to my 49 stitch count. So we get to, I've worked 11 stitches. And then I'm picking up a stitch back behind here. And then skipping over that sunflower center, working in the next 11, and continuing on with that same sequence down through this row. We get to that sunflower. Don't forget that 11th stitch there. Picking up another stitch back behind. Working in the last 6. I'm going to verify that I'm back up to my 49 stitch count. 1, 2, 49. So I have my right stitch count. So for row 7, I'm going to turn, and for my last 2 rows, I'm just working a double crochet in every stitch. So for row 7 and row 8, and again, these are just the backings, the base, to this sunflower stitch for the petals, big enough to accommodate. So again, this base can be any stitch that you would like. All right, so you can see that I have finished my sample. I have all the petals on my sunflower centers. I have finished 3 rows of backing the double crochet for behind those petals. And then you can see all these pins that I have in each of these petals. And I had talked earlier in the video about these petals wanting to curl up a little bit, especially as you work through your pattern. And so I just did a wet blocking on this. And so in order to do a wet blocking, I have my blocking board here, which is just basically a foam mat. I purchased a foam mat set. They're interlocking mats from Sam's, and they're fairly inexpensive, and it's nice because I can use a smaller mat like this one, or I can interlock them together and do blankets and larger projects as well. But in order to block an item, so in this case what I did is I took a straight pin and I just blocked out my petals, you know, to where they were out straight, and stuck pins in each one of those, as well as putting pins in the corners, creating this nice blocked straight edge. And then once I have pins and everything where I want it to be placed, I took a bottle, a spray bottle, and I repurposed a Windex bottle here. I just washed it out really well and then put water in it. And then I just sprayed my water over my whole project until it was saturated but not sopping wet. Basically, you just want everything to be wet, and then you let it dry. It'll dry faster if you put a fan on it, but I just had this sitting out for about a day, and it probably was ready a while ago. But these are perfectly dry now after a day, and then you can just take your pins out of your project, and you can see how nicely that blocked out these petals. Even without the pin, they're lying nice and flat. So you just take out all the pins, making sure to get all those back into your case, and you have your project finished. I would say if you're making your flowers with acrylic yarn, you could certainly use this same technique. It does have better results, I think, with the cotton yarn, but I have blocked acrylic projects as well using this same technique and had good results as well. So you could do that for acrylic. Try that. You could also do a gentle steam blocking on your acrylic, as long as you don't overheat your project and melt your yarn. But I have steam blocked acrylic as well. So that's all there is to it, and you can see how nicely these are laying flat against the backing. So this really does make a difference. And it's not that much work. It's a little tedious to pin out each one of these. In fact, for my blanket, I didn't even have enough pins to do all of them in one shot. So I basically just set this up in one of my rooms, closed the door, and then over a couple of days I I did all of the sunflowers on my blanket. So that is all there is to it. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. Thank you so much for being here with me. This sunflower stitch is going to be a lot of fun to work, and I am really excited about using this in lots of different projects. So make sure and check back. And make sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, so that way you can get notified whenever I post a new video to YouTube. You can also sign up for my newsletter on my website at nanascraftyhome.com. And you can find me on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram. And make sure and hashtag Nana's Crafty Home every time you share any of my projects on social media. That helps me get to see your beautiful creations. As always, everyone, take care. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.